Hello and welcome to the Video Vortex. This week we're going to be looking at the work of David Lynch, one of the most influential filmmakers of the last 50 years. When we hear the term Lynch, we often get a certain vibe, a certain atmosphere associated with this type of filmmaking. And that's true of some of the greatest auteurs in cinema. Alfred Hitchcock, we hear the term Hitchcockian. Hitchcock was an enormous influence on Lynch, and also Kubrickian for Stanley Kubrick's work. Kubrick considered Lynch's 1977 movie Eraserhead as one of the greatest movies ever made, and I think this makes Lynch worthy of discussion, particularly because he deals with things in a very surrealist manner, dealing with symbolism to try and convey very complex ideas instead of tackling them straight on. This is perhaps most apparent in David Lynch's first feature film, 1977's Eraserhead, which took him 5 years to make. It was very much a student project in a way. Lynch was at the American Film Institute and made the movie on the grounds. They found a kind of farm/barn and converted that into a mini film studio. And there's a lot of influential people around at that particular time. So the actress Sissy Spacek was dating somebody who worked on the movie and actually worked as the clapperboard girl on set for a brief period of time. David Lynch has often said that this is his Philadelphia story. Many people have looked at the famous Katharine Hepburn and Jimmy Stewart movie and gone, there's no similarities whatsoever apart from the fact they're both in black and white. But I believe Lynch was actually referring to his own time in Philadelphia, where he met his soon-to-be wife Peggy and they actually had a child. Whether that was planned or not, it's not for us to say, but I think this movie really represents a man coming to terms with the fact that he's going to be a father and he doesn't feel comfortable. He's a bit reluctant about it in a way, and you can see this in the representation of the characters. The baby, if it is a baby, this kind of odd alien sheep-like creature, is so foreign and so alien, it's no wonder that the central characters find it difficult to relate to it. To quote Lynch, this is a movie which is a dream of dark and troubling things, and it is a very troubling movie with characters like the lady in the radiator, who sings a fantastic song called In Heaven Everything Is Fine, and a lot of people have talked about the symbolism of this. Is this some sort of fantasy about suicide to escape from the trials and tribulations and responsibilities of everyday life? After all, the child is born not from a stable relationship. It's essentially a brief kind of one-night stand situation. It's not really a representation of the character's love. It's something that comes from lust and perhaps the less desirable elements of humanity. And what a lead performance from Jack Nance as well, playing Henry. I think he's great in this movie, and he had to keep his hair like really tall for about 5 years, which in the 70s wasn't really the in thing, and he turns up in a lot of David Lynch's later work as well. Many people find this movie a bit abstract and a bit artsy for the sake of it, but I think it's a true masterpiece of the kind of psychological horror genre. Many people prefer his more commercial movies such as The Elephant Man. It's interesting that a lot of the kind of sound design, what we call the mise-en-scene, the kind of visual representation of things, is carried over into that next movie. It was actually the comedy legend, the producer Mel Brooks, who was really big at the time, actually saw Eraserhead and was looking for a director for his wife Anne Bancroft's latest movie. The Elephant Man is a terrific film, but if we're talking about really pure David Lynch, this is perhaps a bit too mainstream from our taste, but it's well directed. It was nominated for many Oscars and features a great performance by John Hurt and a really good performance by Freddie Jones as Mr. Bites. After this, the Star Wars director George Lucas actually wanted David Lynch to direct Return of the Jedi, which was the third in the original trilogy of Star Wars films. However, Lynch had other plans. He decided to work on Dune, which is a project that had already been started up by another director called Alejandro Jodorowsky, directed two really strange kind of Buddhist Mexican South American movies called El Topo and The Holy Mountain, but the production had fallen through. Had people like H.R. Geiger working on it who went on to design the alien creature. But Lynch picked up this project, and I'm not a big science fiction fan, particularly the kind of thick, soupy science fiction movies, and it was a bit of a disaster for Lynch. He felt a bit lost. He was working with the producer Dino De Laurentiis, who he'd actually gone to work with in another film, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But we see a few of the Lynch regulars show up again, such as Freddie Jones. And you also get the first appearance in a Lynch movie of Kyle MacLachlan, who later go on to star on the next Lynch gold nugget of a movie. 1986's Blue Velvet stands as one of the greatest cinematic achievements of the 1980s and is partially responsible of the great indie boom of directors from that age. Now, looking back at the movie, it might not seem as revolutionary as it once did. And this is a movie that kind of looks under that surface layer of suburban atmosphere, this idea that everything's wonderful and there's beautiful roses and everybody has perfect gardens and perfect marriages. And he kind of took that kind of Hitchcock idea of looking behind the scenes, like his classic movie Shadow of a Doubt, and really exploring that in a bit more depth. And due to the fact there was a great decrease in censorship of cinema from the 1960s onwards, Lynch could go a bit further. This is probably one of his true masterpieces. He got a really great central performance by Dennis Hopper, who was Oscar nominated for this role of Best Supporting Actor as Frank Booth. Apparently he rang up Lynch and actually said, "I am Frank Booth," something that he in later his career later denied, but he was kind of off the rails at that particular time, it's safe to say. He'd been addicted to various drugs, heavy drinking. He'd had a failed marriage to one of the singers of the Mamas and Papas, I think Michelle Phillips, I think she was called. And this was something that got his career back on track. And it's an interesting movie because it really mixes film noir elements, the kind of 1940s and 50s, some iconography from the 60s, and also bringing things up to the 80s. It starts off with this kind of golly gosh character of Kyle MacLachlan, who seems really sweet and innocent. And halfway through the movie, you see Frank Booth come into this, and a lot of people see this as a comment on a very Freudian concept of what's called the Oedipus complex. I'm not a big fan of this idea. It's this idea that essentially boys want to have sex with the mothers, and they really resent the father role. And some people have seen the role of Frank and Isabella Rossellini's character. She, of course, is the daughter of the famous actress Ingrid Bergman, who's really fantastic in this movie, as representing his parents in a way, and he actually goes on to have sex with the mother figure in this movie. But he ends up with Laura Dern in the end, so, you know, there's worse things that happen in the world. The movie is noticeable for Lynch fans because it features his first full cinematic collaboration with Angelo Badalamenti, one of the most underrated film composers from the kind of 1980s onwards in cinema. He also mixes in some fantastic recordings from the kind of 50s and 60s. You get the Roy Orbison song In Dreams, which they actually re-recorded, but it very much sounds like the original recording in the movie from the 60s. And you even get Frank Booth just almost kind of semi-quoting, paraphrasing lines from that movie in a really sinister way. His famous line where he goes, "I'll send you a love letter." I won't say the profanity in there. "I'll send you a love letter straight from my heart." You know, really, really, you know, sinister stuff. And you get the great, I think it's Kitty Lester song that Alison Moyet and Elvis did covers of. Love Letters as well, fits in very thematically. And you notice great thematic changes throughout that movie. For when it's kind of happy and innocent, it looks kind of bubblegum. The mise-en-scene is very bright, hyper-stylized. But after the sequence where Kyle MacLachlan's character, Jeffrey Beaumont, is raped, you see a sort of saturation of the colours here. And it's kind of taking that 50s image and going, that ain't real, sunshine. You know, we're seeing underneath the layers of American society. And in an age of movies like American Beauty and all these fantastic American TV shows, this is kind of the norm. But this was quite, you know, ahead of its time in the mid-1980s. Not every critic digged this movie. Roger Ebert is a big Lynch fan, however he objected to the treatment of the actress Isabella Rossellini and very much wrote some negative reviews of this movie. Many people have seen it as misogynistic. And it's true that there is some really difficult stuff in here to kind of watch, and I think it's very much one of them films that commentates on the darker side of male behaviour, and that's what its primary focus is, and that kind of casts a shadow over women. Instead of going, right, we're going to be anti-feminist, we hate women, anything like that, it's not the case to me. It's showing the bad behaviour in men and the fact that can have a negative impact on women. That's a big debate in cinema that's often sort of aimed at directors like Sam Peckinpah, if you show sexism or racism or homophobia in a movie, does that make it a homophobic, racist, or sexist movie? And I think it's important to take a lot of these issues and look at them seriously. In movies, somebody once said to me that the Clint Eastwood movie Gran Torino was a racist film. Personally, I think this woman that said that was misinformed, to say it politely. She kind of grew up in the political correct generation, and it's important that we tackle these issues head on. The next film that Lynch made of note was Wild at Heart from 1990, which is what he made when he was still kind of working on the TV series Twin Peaks, which we're not going to dwell on much today, but it was a very revolutionary series. Series 1 is definitely worth checking out. Wild at Heart actually won Lynch the Palme d'Or at the Cannes Film Festival, which is quite a controversial win. Some people have felt that later Lynch movies sometimes go into self-parody. I found that a little bit with this one. It's a bit too fantastical, but Lynch was never one for subtlety, apart from perhaps in The Elephant Man. And this is kind of like a play on representations of things like characters in The Wizard of Oz and Elvis Presley, who Nicolas Cage is very much modelling that character on, and of course in real life he was married to Lisa Marie Presley for a while. He even gets up singing Love Me and Love Me Tender throughout the movie. But I found this incredibly over-the-top movie. You get a great performance though by Willem Dafoe as Bobby Peru. The sequence where he's got the tights over his head and he's like robbing a bank or a petrol station, whatever it is. You can see his drool through the tights. He's like, "You're a dummy, or something. One of his lines like that is really disturbing. It's a bit too populist for me, this, not to sound pretentious. This is one of Lynch's first collaborations with a writer called Barry Gifford, and I'd later go on to work on another movie that we're going to talk about in a second. Before that was 1992's Twin Peaks Fire Walk With Me, which was very much a sort of sequel slash prequel as well, tied into the TV series. A lot of fans wanted it to tie up loose ends, however to many it just confused the narrative even more so. But it took some of those kind of core themes of desire and betrayal, etc. And in the cinematic world it allowed to explore them perhaps more graphically and explicitly than the TV series. But to return to the influence of Barry Gifford, David Lynch worked with him on the 1997 movie Lost Highway, and Lynch has actually gone on to say that this is very much a commentary in a way, kind of riffing off some of the vibes of the O.J. Simpson case. This idea of a kind of jealous lover doing what's perceived as being irrational behaviour. Many people say this is one of Lynch's best movies. I think this is half of one of Lynch's best movies. I think the first half of this movie is absolutely terrific. The scenes with Patricia Arquette and Bill Pullman are very, very atmospheric and creepy. And I'm not a psychologist, sociology is my background, but the character is supposed to suffer some sort of psychogenic fugue, is the technical term, where he is so compounded by the guilt, he has to form a new personality to try and deal with that guilt. And to me, this is Lynch kind of wrestling with some themes in his movie, and he doesn't quite get it right yet. He's still experimenting with them. He's wrestling with these concepts, but he's not quite there. But to me, he goes on to perfect these a bit later on in his career in another film that we're going to look at later. Lynch needed a bit of a commercial hit to prove that he wasn't a straight indie man. In 1999, he made The Straight Story, which was a movie, believe it or not, for Disney. And it had a few Oscar nominations for different things. I think it was cinematography, and the lead actor got a nomination shortly before he died. He makes an appearance in the film Misery, which is based on a Stephen King play. He's pretty good in that. And even though it's a Disney film and a family film, you can see the imprints of Lynch's style on there, the composition of the images, the sound design. Some of the central themes, then you get some Lynch regulars like Harry Dean Stanton in there, and that's a true sign of an auteur. Now what we call an auteur is the director that imprints their particular mode, themes and style onto a movie. So I've mentioned before, Hitchcock, Kubrick, Cronenberg, people like that, and I put Lynch in that kind of category with them. People have a very unique style, and oh boy was that style going to really flourish in his next movie, which had a slightly troubled production. The 2001 movie Mulholland Drive is rated in a Sight and Sound magazine poll as one of the greatest movies ever made. Despite this, it had a really troubled production in that it actually started out as a pilot for a TV series, kind of the next generation of Twin Peaks in a way. And it was rejected by the studios. The big rumour is they felt that Naomi Watts was too old. Talk about fussy. And the project was actually picked up by Studio Canal, who are a French company who gave Lynch a bit more money to make it into a feature film. And I think this movie is our generation's Sunset Boulevard. This is one of the few movies where, while it was on, I actually stood up, I will admit this, and started clapping in the Club Silencio scene. I think it's one of the greatest scenes in cinema history. It's absolutely incredible. You get some great lead performances as well by Naomi Watts. I think it's a best performance. It was really a star-making role for her. You get an excellent score by Angelo Badalamenti, who actually appears in the film as well. It's a scene where he like spits out some coffee, which is kind of hilarious and quite scary at the same time. Now we're getting into spoiler territory now. A lot of people actually debate the narrative, i.e. the storyline of this movie. And the way that I saw it, and I must confess after reading a lot of stuff on the internet, is, big spoilers, the first 2 hours of the movie is basically a dream. It's a sort of fantasy, in a way, of the Naomi Watts character, Diane. And in the fantasy, she's called Betty. She's this very kind of naive actress that comes to Hollywood who wants to hit it big. And in the last 20 minutes of the movie, you see what really happened where she's playing Diane. This character is very repressed and jealously gets a hitman to kill her girlfriend, who's been having an affair with a guy called Adam Kesher, played by Justin Theroux. And the first 2 hours, in my opinion, is her in her mind kind of trying to justify the actions that she's done in her real life in this kind of fantasy world. And towards the end of the movie, you see that fantasy world break down in the Club Silencio scene, which is absolutely incredible when that singer is singing the movie. Forgive the pronunciation, Gerando, spelled Rando, but it's in Spanish. And then you realise everything you're seeing is not real, because this singer is booming out this beautiful song and you're really invested in it. Lynch holds the camera on her. You're fully invested in this brilliant, beautiful singing. And then her lips stop moving and the song carries on and the central characters realise essentially that they're in a dream. I thought this was utterly genius, this movie. Not the kind of film you want to watch for your parents if you're younger. There's some rude bits in, but that's not the worst thing in the world, seeing Naomi Watts naked. But I think this is great, and it was nominated for several different Oscars. It got Lynch an Oscar nomination, and I think this is a really terrific movie that any, film scholar or media student should definitely check out. Now, Lynch's latest film, which goes back as far as 2006, is Inland Empire. It's a little while since I've seen this movie. I've seen it a couple of times. It's a very controversial film in the Lynch canon. Many people hail it as his ultimate masterpiece. Some see it as the kind of final kiss-off to Hollywood after the fantastic Mulholland Drive. It took him about 2.5 years to make this movie. It was filmed in Poland and several other different countries. Some beautiful landscapes, but on the whole it was shot on digital video, and at times it kind of looks pixelated. This was a time directors like him and Michael Mann felt that digital cinematography allowed people to get really close up to people's faces to catch these expressions in a way. And I found that true like found footage movies from the kind of like 90s onwards. People are used to video cameras and things, zooming in and out, crazy handheld cameras, and that kind of makes it more personal to people, and I think that's what some of the directors were riffing off. But Lynch was working on this movie without a screenplay, and it carries on some of the themes of identity on from Mulholland Drive. Laura Dern's great in a central role in this movie. Now the plot is quite confusing. Now please forgive me if I get it slightly wrong, but essentially a actress comes to make this movie, so you have her real life as an actress, and then you have the character that she is playing in the movie as like a next layer, as a parallel narrative. It's part of a meta-narrative, do you like that? And then you get another layer because previously they tried to make this movie once before. Now I'm not sure if the kind of third layer is the actress that was going to be in the original version of the movie, or it's her character in that movie. And these three narratives are intertwined, and I always say it's a bit like watching Natural Born Killers. That's how I understood the film in a way. We like watching one continuous story, but it's like flicking through different channels, and there's a scene where one of the characters is flicking through channels and they see this weird scene with like rabbits on the TV voiced by Naomi Watts and the other actress from Mulholland Drive, and that's the way that I saw this movie. And it has a lot to say about identity. I don't personally see it as Lynch's masterpiece, but there are some terrific sequences in it. There's a scene where you're so invested in it. I'm not going to spoil which one it is. Laura Dern's in it, and she's acting her socks off, and you think, right, curtains for her character, game over. It's a good, sort of 10-15 minute sequence, and you think, wow, this must be the end of the film. And then the camera pans back to reveal a camera filming her, and it's part of the movie that she's making. Just amazing. I remember it just being it's incredible. And then she just stands up and walks off set, so you realise it's part of the film that they're making. You've been so invested in that moment, it makes you question some of the different sequences that you've seen previously. I'm not a prude, and I'm not conservative by any stretch of the imagination. Some of the Lynch movies have quite a lot of profanity in them, particularly Wild at Heart, and there's quite a bit in Inland Empire. If that's not your thing, you might not dig some of his movie. There's quite a lot of sexualised language in Blue Velvet as well. I don't mind it as much in that movie because it's appropriate thematically in a way, but I would strongly recommend the work of David Lynch. Each one of these movies warrants its own episode, but I thought we'd do a Lynch special to encourage people to check them out. Thank you for watching this episode of the Video Vortex. It's been a pleasure as always. Good night.